I'm thrilled today to have as a guest here to speak about the issues in secondary use of data for research purposes, Shmerling Magazanik. Lamore is a good friend, and I'm so grateful for her to coming in. She is one of the global leaders in this space as managing director of the Israeli Tech Policy Institute. She leads a think tank that's looking at what are the issues that are around the use of data and the use of technology to spur innovation within a country that is renowned for being the startup nation, a country that invests and knows how to do innovation. And what are the public policy lessons from that that people can learn all over the world about the way to create a public policy environment that does spur innovation, but also protects individuals with a focus on privacy and cybersecurity. Lamore came to ITPI after a decade with the Privacy Protection Authority, including as Director of Strategic Alliances. She is a lecturer at Hebrew University's Faculty of Law and the IDC Herzliya School of Law. And what we're going to do is she's going to deliver a lecture, and then we're going to open up for questions. So I know you all have questions based on the report that we shared. So hold those a bit, and then we'll open up for questions after Lamore's lecture. Lamore, thank you again, and I will turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, David. This is so wonderful to be here, and hello, everyone. And it is okay if you have specific clarification questions during the presentation. Something that I've said is unclear, then you can signal and ask during, and then we can have the discussion at the end. So my talk today is going to be focusing on the intersection of medical research and data research. And it applies in a broad sense to health-related big data research. And it's an intersection that brings together legal frameworks from both biomedicine and data protection. And it also brings into the mix the development of AI in general, as it relates to health data and the development of health service. I will specifically focus today on the secondary use of health data for research. And I want to explain a little bit what that means. It means data that has been collected for the primary purpose of healthcare giving, to provide a person, each individual, with the healthcare that they require at a specific point in time in life. And this data that has been collected, processed, and accumulated is then repurposed for data research. In other occasions, it can also be data that has been collected as part of a specific clinical trial, a medicine or a cure for a specific disease. And then the data that has accumulated within this clinical trial is repurposed for another type of data analysis that can be totally unrelated. So I think another challenge that you're going to hear here in this talk is also the connection of research in this space that has to do with different countries, different nations, different geographies around the world that again have different policies and variations of regulations. And I'd like you to imagine that you are now working at an AI company. You're developing a virtual reality solution for some genetic disability, and you wish to gain access to relevant patient data held by a health management organization, a sick fund, a hospital that has expertise in this condition, and each are in different countries. And you also wish to partner with expert academic researchers from other countries. Or you can imagine that you're a government, and this is very timely and easy to imagine. You're a government coping with a pandemic caused by a virus, and you wish to base policy decisions on data and share it with others who can contribute analysis to the findings and hopefully solutions to the pandemic that for example, we're experiencing right now. So the COVID pandemic has really emphasized the crucial role that data collection, analysis, sharing, and dissemination play for stakeholders, for governments, for academic institutions, for private sector businesses. Everyone was racing to advance scientific research to help combat the virus, whether it's with vaccines or cures. And this all presents quite a complex set of considerations. So I'm going to shortly go through the regulatory fundamentals on the international and the national level in this space, talk about the components of the new policies that we have been following and presented in the report that you've read, and talk about the access models and the stakeholders that can join in these collaborative research efforts, and then talk about the complementary safeguards that include both a procedural level, a technological level, and a normative level. And you will probably hear during the entire presentation the tensions and the potential friction that we can find when we work in this quite complicated space. So to start with the regulatory fundamentals, the first set of rules we have come from the medical research. The other set come from data protection. This is, as I said, an intersection of the two, which creates quite a lot of questions. So the first, let's say, major document that we rely on is the WMA Declaration of Helsinki, the World Medical Association, and their ethical principles for medical research involving human subjects from 1964. And these specifically involve clinical trials that have to do with the human body, with our personal bodies. They're called interventional studies. So you will mainly find these principles applied to medical research, but still in 2000, the declaration was amended to include research on identifiable human material and data. So there is awareness already from the 2000s that there are data issues and data processing issues. And of course, you probably know that medical confidentiality is a cornerstone of medical research. But the emphasis here is that these studies are of the human body, are interventional studies. And the major requirement is that the researchers get the informed consent of all participants. And furthermore, the Council of Europe has created the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine. This is of 1997. It also states that scientific research in the field of biology and medicine shall be carried out freely, subject to the provisions of the convention. But it also states that everyone has the right to respect for private life in relation to information about his or her health. So we've had an equation for many years. Medical research is essential. It even constitutes an imperative that is part of serving our human rights to life and health. It involves the human body and should not be conducted without each person's informed consent. Now, if we move on to data protection, moving from medical research to the data processing space, in the 1980s, the OECD guidelines laid out the principles of privacy protection to enable, as they say, trans-border data flows. So to enable collaboration and processing of data between organizations around governments, countries. And they apply to any type of personally identifiable data in any sector. So it applies to health, finance, education, government services, e-commerce. So data protection regulation and laws are not type specific only to the health space. They involve any sector where personal information is being processed. And one of the primary principles is the collection limitation principle, which says that data processing requires a legal basis. You cannot just collect data and do whatever you want with it. You need a legal basis. And that's the very European type of legislation that is now very dominant around the world. So the primary principle says that you need a legal basis. There should be limits to the collection of personal data, and any such data should be obtained by lawful and fair means, and where appropriate, with the knowledge or consent of the data subject. So here you can listen to the start of a different concept. Whereas in medical research, clinical trials, absolutely only consent, informed consent, strong consent. Here in data protection, even though the general public usually thinks that consent is the only way to use data in Europe, that's not actually the case. So the European regulation, the GDPR, has 6 different legal bases for using data. And it doesn't necessarily need to be consent when we're talking about health data research, and we're going to see this momentarily. So the GDPR recognizes that scientific research is an issue of prime interest to the public. And it reads in the recital that for the purposes of this regulation, the processing of personal data for scientific research purposes should be interpreted in a broad manner, including, for example, technological development and demonstration, fundamental research, applied research, and privately funded research. So for example, a private sector company like the AI startup that you are all work in, we all work in, let's do this together. So that private sector company can be a part of the data processing for this purpose. And it can be a pharma company, it can be a tech company. And AI model development can be a legitimate purpose of using the data under the GDPR. There are also specific allowances, explicit allowances for the secondary use of personal data for scientific research in the GDPR. So you can see in the language here that personal data shall be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes, and not further processed in a manner that is incompatible with these purposes. But further processing is possible for archiving purposes in the public interest, scientific or historical research purposes, statistical purposes, and this is all sometimes I think what I hear from representatives of companies when we discuss this topic, there's a conception that GDPR doesn't allow the use of data, and especially health data, which is sensitive. And here, reading this language, I think we can understand that in essence, that is not true. So this opens the possibility for the repurposing of healthcare data for big data research, and also the repurposing of clinical research data. And I want to emphasize here and try and define a little bit, when we're talking about big data research, a significant difference from clinical trials, which, as I said, are interventional. Big data research is non-interventional in nature. And also it generally includes much larger quantities of data, much more diversity of types of data, and larger sizes of population than clinical trials. And this may sway the balance also from the emphasis of the Helsinki type and patient laws, legal basis, and approval duties to the data protection type ones, because we're talking about health research and data research at the same time. But which is it more? Is it more health research or more data research? That has consequences to the way we manage the legalities of doing this research. Another set of legal requirements that we need to take under consideration if we want to do this project, since we're discussing health data specifically, There's another set of rules in the GDPR that apply because health data is a special category of sensitive data. So processing is forbidden, but for several derogations, permissions, including for reasons of substantial public interest and for reasons of public interest in the area of public health, such as protecting against serious cross-border threats to health, or ensuring high standards of quality and safety of healthcare and of medicinal products or medical services. So we hear pandemic here and also other potential legitimate purposes, and also for scientific research in general. But these need to be based on union or member state law. I want to take a pause here and put this in context for you. You may know this, but just to make sure, the European Union and the GDPR is a general regulation of the European Union. It applies automatically within all member states. States would be France, Germany, etc., Finland, the countries that combine into the EU. But at the same time, member states of the European Union can enact their own laws. And in various regulations, including the GDPR, it is possible that when the general regulation allows it, a member state can enact its specific law in a specific sector or use case or type of activity. And that will allow further allowances on top of the GDPR. But these need to be proportionate because the general principles of the GDPR need to still be honored. And they need to have safeguards in place because this is still considered a more risky type of activity, processing health data, which is sensitive. So this is the type of framework that the GDPR allows for. And now that we're moving closer into the national level, there are additional legal frameworks governing secondary use of healthcare data for research purposes, and they're getting even more complex. You're still this AI startup that only wants to do some research and get your product working and helping in the healthcare space. So you now need to also move closer and see in each country where you work, what are the general privacy and data protection laws on the national level? And there are also typically 3 layers. So one would be the general privacy data protection laws, and then there will be specific patient privacy laws, public health regulations, and if we look at countries like the US and also Australia, a federal system and a state law system. We have even more layers of legislation that may cover the same topic. I won't go into that, but in the United States, for example, we also have the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, that also applies in certain situations to health data. So if we're in that space, maybe we need to look at the CCPA, maybe we need to look at other data protection laws. It gets even more complicated. In England and in Israel, for example, where we have a legal system of common law, there are also precedents that you need to take into account. So the framework includes statutory law, government decisions, recommendations from health officials, ethics, data protection authorities. This is all of what you need to go through. Any questions so far? Before we proceed to I hope it will be better news or the good news. Questions or comments or thoughts or something that you really want to share now. Okay. Thanks. So in 2017, the OECD have looked at this landscape and abundance and said the following: we think that data is crucial for the health system, And we want to enable data research. We want to enable healthcare organizations and ministries and governments to make decisions on public health based on more data and insights. We want to advance science. We think it's important to advance research of health data. And they recommended in 2017 that the member governments of the OECD legislate data governance frameworks to facilitate the secondary use of health data for research. So this would fall under the member state law, like the GDPR and the European Union allows. And this will also be part of the national level legislation. And in the OECD recommendations, there are two goals. One goal would be to advance the collection, standardization, aggregation, streamlining access to big health data. This is due to problems of data quality, data linkage, data standardization. Even before the legal framework, there's a lot of problems collecting data from different systems, different formats, different protocols, standardizing the data, bringing it into a state that you can use it all together and share it between different types of systems, organizations, languages, codes, etc. So one aim of this OECD guideline is for governments to create the ways to make the sharing of data more possible. And the second goal is to streamline the legal and bureaucratic process of gaining access to data and collaborating in research and allowing multi-stakeholders and nations to collaborate. So we're aiming to promote collaboration on health data research, both at the national level and the international level. And this is a recommendation by the OECD to its member governments. Please go and enact these laws to make sense of this very complicated environment and give the market, give the public a framework that they can work with in order to achieve these two goals. And this is what some countries have done. So in the past 2 years, or even 3 years, countries around the world are creating new paths to seek insights into health data, what health data can reveal and how it can assist us and promote our health. And at the same time, respecting individual rights and protecting specifically people's rights to privacy. So in this survey that we did together at the Israel Tech Policy Institute, together with the Future of Privacy Forum, we looked at these 8 countries, at Australia, England, Finland, France, India, Ireland, Israel, and the United States. And on the macro level, we found commonalities across legal systems and regimes. So in permitting secondary use of healthcare data for research purposes, there are similar approaches, more or less, similar conditions, more or less. And in the types of conditions that include several groups of safeguards. So it would be review by ethical boards, de-identification at some level, administrative, technical, and contractual safeguards, usually requirements for strong cybersecurity, working on secure and managed platforms. These are basically the requirements in most policies. On a closer look, you can still see significant nuances and ambiguities, and these may be challenging when you want to collaborate on an international level. David, I want to check with you just how much time we have left to make sure that we leave enough time for discussion.
We have 45 minutes left, so you've got lots of time, and this is great.
Great. Okay. So a few words about the definition of health data, because when we're talking big data research or AI model development, we mean health data in the broadest sense possible sometimes. So that would be administrative data, the management of a person's health data file, appointments, billing, everything to do with the administrative part of providing healthcare. There's insurance data, there's demographics, ethnicity, and types of lifestyle, diagnosis, of course, symptoms, prescriptions, immunizations, test results, many times environmental and social elements. So part of the things that specifically in AI, they're aiming to try and find when they're fishing for signals within the data is to be able to connect things that we may have missed. So taking environmental measurements of a specific neighborhood and connecting that with the health of the people, the medical records of the people who live in that neighborhood. Maybe we will be able to find a correlation between, that will be surprising to us, between a specific disease or condition to the environmental data that we have from that neighborhood. Maybe social elements can teach us something new, and previous medical conditions, background conditions, and genetics. We've seen in several countries have been excluded, but not always. It depends for their extra sensitivity. But really, we're talking about a lot of data per individual, per person. And the legal frameworks typically extend the definition of researcher to both academia and government and private sector. It could be pharmaceutical research, pharmacovigilance, how much people adhere to their regimes, even product development and preventive medicine. So the outlook is very broad. We really aim not only to cure a specific, maybe difficult disease, we also aim to monitor public health, to try and prevent, to progress preventive medicine. We want to learn more about people's health and the healthcare system in order to make it better. There's very diverse goals that we come into this expecting to achieve. And so one of the examples that we saw is Finland. So Finland in 2019 passed a law that explicitly intended to clarify the legal basis for broader secondary use of healthcare data. And that law aims to encourage the use of healthcare data and also for social care data. That law includes both. For valuable purposes by enabling users to have a one-stop shop for access requests to such data. So if you're that AI startup that we discussed at the beginning, and you want to work in Finland, and you know that the hospital and HMO in Finland have the data that you wish to use for your study, you can apply to the Health Data Hub, the authority that the Finland government has created. And it has the powers to go to that hospital and HMO, ask for the data, get the data to their virtual environment, computer IT environment, make the data available to you after it has undergone de-identification and within a secure and managed environment. And this is meant to streamline the process. Instead of you needing to negotiate with these hospitals and these HMOs that may wish to share the data or may not wish to share the data. So this, one of the purposes of this law is to enable the data to be collected by the central authority and then shared with researchers. The requirement, the condition is that you convince the authority that there is public interest and there is merit in your study, and then you will be granted access to the data. So this is a centralized system. It's meant to simplify the bureaucratic process and make it easier and more efficient. They just started working not very long ago. I'm hopeful that it is successful as they have wished. And Now let's look at France, and you can see that these are the components that are within these national policies. So the health data application process may not be similar in each and every country, but there will be some kind of process that will allow access to data, granting access to data. And in some countries like Finland and France, which I'll just mention now, they've created a health data hub to collect all of these databases from the different organizations and make them available. So France's model is also creating a central health data hub. In that case, they are actively collecting databases from organizations that hold them around the country and collecting them to be managed by this dedicated authority, whether they have an application or not. They're doing the proactive action of collecting the data. And then they're facilitating the application process. So if you are this startup, you can apply to the France HDH, and an ethical board there will decide if there is a public interest in your research. And after that, the National Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, will be involved in some way in order to give the green light for the data project. So this really reminds us that we're in a double-headed space. We have medical questions, public interest questions, we have data issues, we have data protection authorities together in the mix. What the CNIL did in France, which I have seen, I think only in Australia, is that they created a reference methodology. They created a document that really specified all the technical requirements and procedural requirements that safeguarding the data means. And if you wish to not be obliged to go through the CNIL and get evaluated and wait for their approval, you can declare that you certified yourself with this reference methodology. So you have the blueprint. You can, as a project consortium or as a company, declare, and you need to be compliant, of course, with the declaration, and just send your declaration to the CNIL. And that is also a step that is meant to try and shorten the process and ease the burden. Other countries like England and Australia have, as far as I know, so far not created a central health data hub, but they did connect with their already existing National Data Repository of Patient Records, the EHR. So what they've done is that their national regulations are in place in order to allow access to this EHR, to this collection of health records of patients. And this is, again, using a similar process of application and justification of the public interest, review by an ethical board, and also the identification. Now, just in short, about the complementary safeguards. So I've mentioned consent, and you probably understood by now that consent for this type of data processing may not be the way to go. And this was also declared by the European Data Protection Board. So the European themselves, the board that is the official interpreter of the GDPR and its implementation, has stated that in these types of relationships, in these types of situations, especially in clinical trials, consent is may not be freely given. People are very much interested in getting the treatment, in being in the clinical trial, in getting the medicine that they require, in getting the healthcare that they wish for. So consenting to the data processing is actually not regarded by the EDPB as the highway to getting to using the data. And they actually say that it may be better to rely on other legal bases. So in the various countries that we looked at, consent is usually replaced by some form of waiver, either consent waiver by an ethical board or a review board of some sorts, or safeguards that replace consent and legal bases that replace consent. And this is somewhat different than, I think, in the United States. So from what we've seen in the United States, and this is part of your course material, so probably you know this even better than I do, but an institutional review board or a privacy board can award a waiver of consent if the use or disclosure of the healthcare data involves no more than minimal risk to the privacy of individuals, and that the research could not practicably be conducted with patient consent. So in what instances is it not practicable to receive patient consent? As I said before, big data research involves very large populations. Sometimes it's not practical to go and be able to get the consent of these large groups of people. Sometimes the data required is longitudinal. So that means 20 years, going 20 years back, going 30 years back, trying to find connections between family members and their healthcare along the years. Sometimes people are no longer with us, so gaining their consent is impractical. So these are the types of situations that lead us to, again, a review board, a privacy board that gives a waiver of consent. In Australia, for example, research is permitted where obtaining consent is impracticable. The information is necessary for the research. The research outcome is relevant to the public health or public safety. And a human research ethics committee has approved the project, and there is sufficient de-identification deployed on the data. So you see that the similarities are here. It may sound a little different. The names of the boards may be different, but in essence, whether you call it a board that permits using the data or boards that gives a waiver of consent, at the end of the process, we are reaching the same outcome.
Hey, Limor, can I ask you a question about that?
Yes.
One of the readings that the class did for our last class asked some real questions here in the United States about diverse representation on institutional review boards, and potentially when we don't measure that and or where we might lack that for the use of health data, whether that could put certain populations, particularly our African American and Black population here in the United States, at particular risk, and put at risk having enough trust from that population for their data to be used for healthcare research. And I'm wondering, do we see conversations like that popping up in other countries?
Yeah, excellent question. So I actually saw this discussed, but not on the side of the representatives of the review boards, but as representation within the data. So I think one of the interesting things is that even though consent is usually not the legal basis for this data processing, in many countries, people still have a right to opt out of research. So if your data is going to be used, you will get some form of either public or personal notice. And even though your consent was not required or asked for, you will be able to opt out. Now, this has been critiqued by researchers and public health officials, that in this way we may skew the data and potentially have certain populations opting out and then not represented enough in the research, and therefore in the benefits that the research may bring. Questions of data use and big data research usually raise concerns about data bias. So, and data bias is a problem that has been discussed heavily around AI ethics, and specifically in healthcare, the same thing can happen. So if our data does not represent the population well enough, we may create biases and skew our research results, and that would be a shame. Another thing is, well, I'll say this even maybe further. I've read about the right to be included in research. So there's an interesting paradox because from the data protection and privacy point of view, we are more accustomed to think about people's rights to control their own data and not be part of data processing as a default. But in healthcare giving and health data research, health research in general, the notion is that being included in the research is a human right, because otherwise you may not be awarded the benefits. And that is especially true for orphan diseases. So these are diseases that affect a very small number of people, and therefore there's not enough incentive to research them and find a cure for them or some sort of treatment. So I think that the whole outlook of the healthcare professionals is inclusiveness in the sense of everyone being included in the research and in the benefits from the research. And that's quite different than the thought that we know from the privacy profession.
Thanks. That's exactly what I was looking for. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay. So a few other examples. Irish law in Ireland, for example, a data controller seeking an alternative to consent must apply to a special central committee to assess whether the public interest in conducting health data research significantly outweighs the interest in obtaining patient consent. Similarly, in France, the board decides if the research purpose is in the public interest. English law is quite similar. The law authorizes secondary use of healthcare data if a researcher shows that obtaining patient consent is not practical and that anonymized information cannot be used. So the activity has a medical purpose. A medical research has received ethics approval from the Research Ethics Committee, and the activity is in the public interest or in interest of improving patient care. I think that this gives us a good segue to the question of de-identification, which is quite major in data processing in general, and also specifically here in the health, secondary use of health data for research. So de-identification, anonymization, I don't know if you discussed this in class, David.
We did cover it last week.
Last week, okay, perfect. So you actually, so you know this, and you can take what you discussed about the levels of de-identification, the trustworthiness of an anonymization or pseudonymization, as the GDPR calls it, and to what extent can we rely on and trust the process of de-identification, and rely that re-identification and reverse engineering of that process is not something we need to be concerned about. So there are variances between national policies in how they define that risk. So France and Finland are guided by the de-identification standards of the European Data Protection Board under the GDPR. In Finland, for example, the law is that only aggregate data can be freely available to the public, and all other forms of personal data, including pseudonymized data, are available only in a secure user environment and subject to contractual restrictions to not re-identify the data. So where can this be problematic? In essence, it's a good idea. I think that the idea of maintaining the data within a virtual environment that is controlled and secure by a responsible organization or a government body is a good one. Where is the conflict? Where, for example, we may have a group of researchers that have a proprietary algorithm and IP that they wish to secure that is new, and they will be reluctant to bring that asset into that environment, and they would elect or prefer to receive the data to them. Of course, this is a conflict that has pros and cons to both sides, but these are the types of issues that I've heard from startup companies and also from large tech companies when this type of restriction is mentioned by national regulations. The UK historically has taken the position that de-identification risk can be remote. So remote is now the word that we are using. How do you quantify remote? Under US law, as you learned, de-identified under HIPAA is data that has been identified according to HIPAA is no longer considered protected health information. So it is not yet anymore, still subject to restrictions. This is not necessarily the case in other countries. What I would have liked to have come across, and I haven't yet, is a risk analysis of re-identification and some sort of metrics to evaluate the strength of pseudonymization. Because I really haven't been able to wrap my head around the difference between remote possibility to reasonable risk to all types of other wordings. And I don't really know what's the basis to evaluate whether a specific case of de-identification meets that standard. I haven't yet met those standards, and I think that's a huge question. From what I've also experienced within ethical boards or approval boards or policymakers in those types of decision points, is that with the lack of those metrics, there's great concern and hesitation to approve use of data. So I think that this is a key question, a very complicated, probably mathematical challenge. And I think to some extent it requires a case-by-case analysis, a risk analysis for each specific case. What is the type of data that is to be shared? What other types of data can be combined with it? And what would be the risk to the re-identification in that aspect? What I do try to remind people who are concerned is that de-identification is not the only safeguard. If we take into account that we have a virtual environment that is secure and logged and monitored, so you cannot do whatever you want within it, and you cannot take the raw data out of it, only the results of your calculations. And you add to that the fact that there are contractual agreements that oblige the researchers to respect those requirements. And there's supervisions by government bodies or other monitoring. So when you have those multiple safeguards, the de-identification is just one piece. So the fact that we cannot achieve, or probably cannot achieve, 100% bulletproof de-identification, I don't think should deter us from sharing data for research, because it's just one building block of all of the rest of the mechanisms that we have in this project. I think, David, I will skip the cross-border data transfers issue, which is also an issue here, unless you really want to go into that.
Do you just want to do maybe a minute on it, just to describe it? Because I do think it's important.
Okay. So another issue, since we're talking about international collaboration on health data research, especially with the pandemic in mind. So it's obvious that we need international data flows for these types of data computations. So data protection frameworks apply generally applicable restrictions to the transfer of health data for research purposes. And this is to guarantee a high level of protection of the data. Because remote access to personal data is considered a transfer under the GDPR, then even if you do not actually send the data cross-border, the fact that you allow access to the data from another country, from another nation, could also create problems. And there are also the implications of the Schrems II decision that was made last summer by the European Court of Justice that is canceled the Privacy Shield, the framework that allowed the transfer of data about Europeans to the United States. And in light of these developments, it's required in each and every international potential sharing of health data for research to evaluate the legalities of the data transfers and data sharing. And specifically in the health data research regulations, in some countries, there are data localization requirements. So for reasons of risk mitigation and for fears and concerns of losing control of data, the Israeli draft, for example, requires localization of the health data when used for secondary purposes. Australia also requires localization of the data in borders. And India, the India regulation is still a draft, but it also has a data localization requirement. And that is a real challenge because let's assume that we want to carry on sharing data between researchers at Duke, at Sheba Medical Hospital in Israel, and in France. And now, how are we going to go about doing that when we have data localization requirements in various places? So that adds another layer of challenges. I hopefully this will, find its solution on the general level, and then that will also affect positively on the health data research front.
Limor, thank you for doing that, and to do that in such a short period of time. I apologize, but I do think it's critically important for everybody to realize that we need to get more diverse health data available, particularly as you referenced earlier, for the identification of treatments for orphan diseases and for advances in personalized medicine. At the same time, for very legitimate reasons, governments are concerned about data leaving countries and are putting these data localization requirements in place. So it's going to be increasingly a difficult space to be able to navigate. I know that the students have a whole bunch of questions, and so I want to get into that very quickly. So I'm going to hold back on asking mine because I also have a bunch of questions. And first, let me go to Olivia.
Hi, Limor. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Very excited to speak with you also on Sunday. I have a question related to what you spoke about today, but also more so with Israel. So Israel obviously collected a lot of data from those contact tracing apps. And I was wondering if that data is going to be repurposed, as you were discussing earlier in the presentation, and if it's going to be used for future research. And then the second part of that question is, if it is going to be used, who gets the access to that data? And then what controls will be on that data?
Excellent questions. So the Ministry of Health in Israel did plan and try and not yet executed on creating a data hub of COVID patients' data and additional data collected in the context of COVID, and aims to make it available to researchers in this type of environment I was talking about. So a locally controlled, virtual, secure environment researchers go through an application process, they get vetted, they signed confidentiality agreements, and this was not yet, and it's been going on for over 6 months. It was not yet approved by the higher Helsinki board in Israel, which is the one that needs to approve this. And for concerns of data privacy and questions of the identification. So we're living it. The things I was talking about, it's not ancient history. It's not, it's today. It's happening now. I don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Thanks. Luke Schwartz.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking today. So I'm a part of Professor Hoffman's privacy implications of COVID contact tracing research team. And specifically, me and my sub-team have focused internationally, and we have weighed the efficacy and privacy of contact tracing apps used across the globe. And specifically, one of our big points has been interoperability between contact tracing apps. And I think it's funny that you brought this up at the end of your lecture, but I was curious about how you potentially saw interoperability and continued data sharing between countries expanding as a result of the pandemic into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that it's absolutely essential. If not this pandemic, then sometime in the near future, it would be, I think, an evolvement that we will go through in the digital space. I think one of the drivers currently is the concept of immunity certifications, because in order to reopen borders, reignite travel, get back to international physical flows, not only data flows, but ourselves, if you still remember what it's like to go abroad. I used to travel so many times yearly to so many places around the world. Apart from really missing it, I'm thinking that if the world wants to go back to that, and that's another discussion. Currently, at present time, I'm aware of the world, I think, aviation associations, etc., pushing very actively for immunity certifications. And I think that that is an example of what type of international interoperability will be required in order to do that. And that's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge that hasn't been met yet with biometric passports, and that started after 9/11. So you can see how long it takes to create digital systems that will operate interoperably across the globe. It's a huge challenge.
Daniel.
So thank you so much for the presentation. My question cornerstones mainly on the hub that you were describing, the hub of information, the hub of aggregate information, and how different that might be internationally, or with the EU, with the GDPR and international organizations like that, versus HIPAA in the United States, where that's much more decentralized. Each private industry has the onus to protect its own data that it collected. So if the government or the central authority that you were describing were to create a hub of this information, it seems that would be a place to house a cybersecurity attack or a cyber attack on that place to access that information. So my question is, how safe is that information really? Is the security of the hub like in constant audits, and what's the oversight that goes into an international organization hub of health data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So centralizing data, of course, creates cybersecurity risk and data breach risk. From the plans I've seen, usually these entail cloud services and sometimes even a designated or dedicated cloud that will be only for that government body or only for that specific activity. So even more secure than the general cloud that you would see and use for consumer or corporate purposes. I think that the necessity of very high level services and applications would also motivate cloud use and motivate centralized hubs of some sort. But I know that there are also attempts to use decentralized approaches for those types of activities. And yep, I think I'll stop.
No, Limor, I think that answer also, it's the exact same thing I'm starting to hear from a lot of cybersecurity researchers that are concerned about ransomware attacks on healthcare institutions. It seems that a lot of the incident response folks, one of their first recommendations out to clients is move your critical data to a major cloud provider, because the cloud providers are going to be in the business of providing the best protection that you can get. I think I don't have any specific data to say that that's a bad recommendation. I'm also not sure whether we have a lot of data to support that that's a great recommendation. And I think it's a big experiment that we're going to be running, and it puts a tremendous burden on these cloud providers, which are then increasingly going to become an even more attractive target, I think, for cyber criminals and for others that might want to attack those individual healthcare institutions and or gain the benefit from the healthcare data.
I absolutely agree, and I will maybe add that my experience working at the Israeli Privacy Protection Authority, I was managing the Administrative Enforcement Department for many years. So I was also responsible for data breach investigations and have been following them even now in Israel. And it's a generalization, but the level of security, of cybersecurity in health organizations, in service providers, in pharmacy chains, in retailers of health devices is usually less or much less than cloud providers. And the data breach incidents that I've come across that involved cloud providers were almost always the customer not using the security measures that the cloud provides, or not using an integrator to configure the cloud and to apply the products in a way that they should be. So if you use the cloud and you use it properly, and you either take the service for security, or you bring your own specialists and advisors and do security right on the cloud, I think that without having the data, David, I agree. Generally, my hunch is that that'll provide you with much better cybersecurity.
Shreyas.
Hi, thank you very much again for presenting. I learned a lot today, and I was grateful for your insights. So I was curious, when you're talking about the health data hubs, so more generally, so you mentioned that to retrieve information from the health data hubs, that the countries and typically ethics review boards would consider like public interest in whether or not these companies should have access to the data for what they're using it for. Are there also considerations of public interest in like sharing data? So for example, for like clinical trials on COVID vaccines, would the government require companies to share, or are there to share information, since this is a matter of like of public health going forward? Or are there other incentives that countries use more generally to incentivize companies to share their data, to pool their data into the health data hubs?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't come across too many. So one incentive could be providing a platform. So buying the cloud storage service and applications is costly. So an incentive could be a government creating a platform, and let's say a startup accelerator that provides those services and that space free to startups, and that could be a way to incentivize those developers to come. With health organizations, the bigger they are and the more data they have, the less they are willing to share. And I've heard this both here in Israel and in other places around the world. Usually organizations perceive the data that they hold and manage and process as their own asset. That's a huge question in data protection, whether the data is the property of the patients, the people, the individuals, or is it after it has been processed, managed, collected, and invested in, does it become the property of the organization? And in any case, governments who do not manage the healthcare system themselves. So in Israel, we have 4 HMOs, sick funds, who service the population. They're licensed by the government, but they hold the data. And it's sometimes quite difficult for the government to convince them to share data with others. So that's an issue.
I love that. And I actually think it's an area where ITPI can be really helpful. I think we tend to respond first with regulatory approaches, putting restrictions and requirements in place, and don't necessarily always think about the incentives that could be provided to get to the same results. That's great. Lucy.
Hi, Lamorne. Thank you for speaking with us today. I was just wondering about the security of the infrastructure for sharing on an international level. So, even between GDPR, the UK, and America with HIPAA, the differences in the infrastructure setups that we have between the nations, and then how the security of that infrastructure kind of applies to all the different regulations that are in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good one. So firstly, that reminds me of a new initiative in the EU called the EU Data Spaces. So there's a new law in the European Union, the Data Governance Act, and that is meant to enable the creation of data spaces in health and in other sectors, so education, finances, etc. And these will be data hubs per sector that will combine data from all European Union member states. So that will be one experiment of collecting data between a group of countries. Reconciling the differences between Europe and the United States, that's a big challenge that has to do now with the politics of data flows and international data flows. I think that needs solving before we get to the cybersecurity. I have a hunch, again, I don't know, but I'm thinking that since on the cybersecurity level and intelligence agencies level, these governments and countries do tend to cooperate, then perhaps creating the cybersecurity framework for a unified data space would not be the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem would be the inclination to share the data and work together.
Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us. And your last answer sort of ties into something that I was curious about. The law you spoke about that was passed in Finland was really interesting to me. And it seems, at least from my perspective, that the population of Finland might be a little bit more trusting of the government than a lot of people are in the US. And so could you perhaps touch upon what steps, at least foundationally, might be necessary to be taken for such a thing to be possible in the US, where I think people are much more reluctant to share their data and are, I think, especially less trustworthy of sort of broader institutions.
Yeah, good question. I think that, well, the problem in the United States is firstly the decentralization of the healthcare system. So the governments that I mentioned, Israel, Finland, France, England, all have some form of universal healthcare system that provides healthcare for the entire population. And that is the place we start from. Having a decentralized healthcare system, I think kind of puts a damper on the whole being able to collect that data. It's so fragmented in the United States. I'm not sure. It will probably take some time before it will be possible. What you're raising is another perspective, because it is possible not to go through health organizations, but to go to people and ask them out of solidarity, out of social caring. Will you be willing to collect your health data yourself and share it in some form in a way that is inspiring trust? I don't know how would that work in any of the countries I've mentioned. So in that respect, let's assume that we're approaching the citizens in Finland and asking each and every one of them to bring their health data file and share it with the hub. I'm not sure that the amount of the participation would be very much better than the United States. I think that when the default is that you have to actively do something, actively take your data and put it somewhere, I think that there's a barrier that all people psychologically have, no matter their level of trust of government. But I'm just speculating here. But it's a good question to follow up if you're doing research.
Yeah, thank you so much. It probably will be a long time before any action in that space can be taken. Thank you.
Limor, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thanks. And I recognize if there are any of you that we're going to make late for another class, please feel free to go while we cover these last couple of questions. Katie.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This was very informative. So I have kind of a 2-part question. It relates to the option of opting out, and if your information is used or your data is used, then you're notified. I'm just wondering, like, how many people really opt out, and like at what percentage does that data get skewed, and what's that notification process like? Do people get to learn more about the research? Do they get to ask questions? And I guess part of that question is, how do they encourage people to?
I lost your audio, Katie, but I'll start answering. In France, for example, the requirement is to notify people of the data processing being done and their right to opt out by advertising in the media and by hanging posters in offices of government buildings and health organizations and hospitals. I know that here in Israel recently, around that health data hub that for COVID that they wanted to start, there was a big argument whether people should get personal texts to their phones that notify them that this is happening and that they have an opt-out option. We had a project a couple of years back where the government created a new national credit history database. And the legislation for that demanded that the Central Bank of Israel, who will be creating the project, will notify all of the citizens personally by SMS. And also they require that all of the financial institutions also send out letters to people notifying them of the project and their rights to opt out. And there was a national campaign, TV, radio, and social media to notify people. I think that is the biggest campaign and effort that I've seen here in Israel around a data sharing project of the government. My friend, who is the Chief Privacy Officer of the Central Bank of Israel, says that the percentage of opt-out is less than 1%. But that doesn't say that doesn't mean that people would have opted in if it was the other way around. And you can go and read Dan Ariely's writings and experiments about people defaults. And when the default is opt-in or opt-out, usually the numbers are quite different. And so it doesn't correlate to the same mindset.
Niharika, last question.
Hi, Limor. Thank you so much for presenting to us today. I was a little curious because in this class, we've talked a lot about clinical data versus non-clinical data, especially because there's no real federal privacy legislation in the US. How do you think we should approach the collection of non-clinical data? So I'm thinking about how during the pandemic, Apple introduced that new Apple Watch that does the blood oxygen monitoring that could be really helpful to spot issues and symptoms with COVID-19. How do you think we should govern the use of that data?
Okay, good question. So I think that when we're talking about private sector companies and wearables and those types of data, hopefully you will have a federal privacy law soon enough, and that will be the correct way. I think that all of the examples I discussed here today apply to data that has been collected by either a government authority or a licensed government, an organization licensed by the government. This is more health data that is collected within the realm of healthcare giving and less recreational. So I think that when it's recreational type of data, even when it's health data, it should still go under the data protection laws and regulations. And that is the contract that we each make with the corporations that we work with, that we use their products and provide our data in the process. And that's a whole other set of laws and regulations. I haven't seen in the national survey that we did, governments that addressed that issue, that question of wearables, because that falls under the regular data protection laws.
And this, I think, is a great question to finish on, also because I actually think we could do a whole nother session. And Limor, maybe we will be able to convince you to come back and talk about that kind of integration and the controls around the data from non-regulated or less regulated non-clinical data in those instances. But I apologize for going over, but it was such a fascinating lecture and so many students had questions. Thank you so much for being willing to do this. For those who are watching this on the recording, I just want to say there's a link to the report that the ITPI did on the use of data for use of health data for research purposes. I recommend it to everybody. It's an incredible compendium to look at all of the different approaches in these different countries and how much we can learn from them as we chart a course for the more productive use of data to save lives and to reduce healthcare costs, but while also still protecting privacy. Limor, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Say